There's a lot of confusion and just like crossed lines around like healing, the erotic, sexuality, the feminine, um, what it is to like work in that area, what it isn't, how everybody is kind of working in that area, why sometimes I refer to my work as all being sex work, but no one understands what that is. So I think that feels like the overarching thing that I have this sense that you can speak to in a way that I haven't had a conversation with somebody publicly around yet.
Mm. And for me, I think it's also coming from a space that has been so erotically charged and that has used that kind of energy to stimulate or accelerate expanded states or transformational states or et cetera, et cetera. There's also in that space a reluctance, it seems, to really draw the lines of like what is capital E, the erotic, what is personal eroticism, what is sexuality, how do these things interplay with healing and transformation, what they are and what they aren't.
When you recognize that the erotic is always at play and that essentially all of your life, whether you're conscious of it or not, you're doing some form of lovemaking, even if that form is unconscious and poorly executed, you're still actually doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
so the lack of acknowledgement that the erotic is the primary life force driver that animates, or is one of the most primary forces that animates the way that we experience of our existence, seems to me like a major flaw of missing out on what's actually like here in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And then the co-opting of that into like the smaller or narrower framework for the erotic that is like more personal sexuality or even just about intercourse or some form of like intimate in the bedroom whatever kind of thing also totally leaves the rest of the intimate experiences out in the dust. And then that, of course, really bleeds into things like the patriarchy and capitalism and how those things have deeply cauterized the expression of the erotic and then have sent us into these divergent paths around how we try to indulge its expression kind of behind closed doors or by cheating on life or by like being divergent or all of these weird things that we're doing now when we just won't acknowledge the thing that's actually the thing.
And I'm caught in the limitation often that you're speaking to of if you use the word eros or erotic or intimacy, people have 100 very narrow associations that then there's a body of work that happens just to peel away the barriers so that they can see how much wider the field of play is. I've noticed that there's like an arc where when a blockage starts to soften, there's this shaking that can be emotional, it can be physical, it can be just purely energetic. And then when it dissolves, the current that comes is so
I mean,
strong.
I think what you're speaking about, that shaking at whatever bodies or form that it's taking place, is really just the releasing of the tension that has been held there for sometimes so, so long, where the body is holding onto and within a kind of frame that is holding the erotic at bay. And so the pressure that you have to put on a body in order to make it, to force it into the holding the erotic at bay is like, trying to hold off like the flow of water. And so when that builds over time, you kind of build a really strong wall. And so as you begin to soften that wall in whatever way you would, or sometimes just penetrate the wall, then what happens is you have this, the force of the current behind it that kind of comes in. And of course, that current also is non ordinary. So it's not just that, oh, there's this like whole life force thing that comes through and it's like glorious and perfect because then it's like, oh, I'm back. It's like, no, now you actually have this force of movement that is not really that human and not really that ordinary and has many different fractal dimensions that are part of it. And so that can be its own really problematic state because essentially there's two issues here. One is that we have stopped understanding or convening with non-ordinary phenomena in the regular daily accepted life framework. And then the other problem is we have become so acclimated to the absence of the erotic as if that is life. And so we now fear the thing that is there actually to reanimate us. And we will, I speak about this all the time, we'll defend the wall against it rather than invite the thing back in because we now so solidly believe that that wall needs to be there, even if we don't believe it cognitively. And it's done even more injustice by the fact that we really have mislabeled what the feminine is. The liberation of the feminine is really the journey back to original nature. And so this is like an unglamorous journey, like, right? Like the other ones, they're a really nice sell because, like, I've got this well-groomed pussy and, like, I can talk about the feminine. And, we love that because it makes us feel like we're doing something in the right direction. And it makes us feel like we're taking a stand for something that matters. And all those things are fine, but we should never mistake those things for the actual thing. And that's why we're in this horrific circumstance anyway, is that we've been made to mistake those things, those replications or those approximations for the actual thing. And so when the actual thing, when somebody shows you the path to the actual thing, you're like, oh no, that can't be it. And also, why would anybody want to do that? There's a homeostasis that your system will always try and seek. And there's a benefit to that, but there's also like an edge to that, which is that if your homeostasis has been deeply narrowed or in a framework that is very, very small in comparison to the amount of power that you could have capacity to be with and run, then when that power opens up at some point, you're going to feel deeply out of balance and you're going to have to like find a whole new way of being with that range, that phenomenology, and that presentation and identification within your life.
There's this question around having come from a world where the not quite expressed, but maybe subliminal goal was to blow the doors off and just have people run as much eroticism as they can. But also watching the addictive cycle then play out in that.
Yes. Yes.
What is the how do you work with that energy in a way that is grounded and ethical and balanced and safe and safe enough or healthy enough so that
Mm-hmm.
you don't create these addictive loops in people?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The recognition that there's so much widespread starvation, I think already is radical enough because most people think that they have enough because they don't really understand the nature of desire and they don't really understand the nature of craving and they don't really understand the resolution of that, what that would be experienced as. So I kind of feel like that framework has to come first because that is almost prophylactic in the second part of what you just asked me. Um, I think that like we have become so adapted to absence and starvation that even when it's present, we don't notice it until it becomes catastrophic or until our response to it has become catastrophic. And then what we generally do is what you're saying, we either like provide a replacement for it, which is like maybe this influx of like blowing the doors open, kind of like access to the erotic, really intensity experience. This is the meditation retreat. This is the psychedelic spaces. This is Kundalini yoga, where it's like, oh, you really don't realize that what's driving you there is hunger.
Hmm.
I think what's driving you there is seeking. And so there's something about defining that difference to me that I think really can define the way you engage with the thing and can change your expectations about what the thing's going to give you and then how to do something with it next. So I think when you understand that you're coming out of real, usually multi-lineage type hunger, and that that driving force in you can show up in a very subliminal way, and that when you finally do get a taste of that thing, it's going to be very likely that it's going to be like crack. Because the thing is, it's mostly being delivered within and from systems that have no framework for addiction. We live in a culture of widespread addiction. Capitalism is addiction. And so the patriarchy is addiction. It's only one fractal part of the pattern, but it's a very dominant one. It needs it needs to be predatory in order to survive. It needs an infusion in order to exist. And so anything by definition that needs that is going to have that addictive component. So unless we bring in this kind of front loading of understanding the base patterns in the way I just said it, where it's devoid of all these other associations that then we can opt out of. Because we hear all the other languages and we're like, oh yeah, we're not doing that. So we're not running a program that needs education around addiction. But when you really get down to the bottom of it, almost every program can identify as having issues with it because they're in the Western world. It's nobody's fault. They're just in the Western world and they've been like birthed out of the belly of the Western world. And so I think if we bring in that information, then what happens is the delivery of the erotic comes then within this larger framework. And so then it's like you're not just blowing the doors off of people, you are respecting the fact that their system will have a natural opening towards the erotic when you collapse the things that are against it. But you're not forcing that collapse on anybody, nor do you need to. There's like no reason to force anybody's body into a collapse so they can open into the erotic. Like we are that nature. It's always there. No one has to be like, let me give you a taste of it because you've never had cookies. You always have cookies. It's just that, you've like been turning towards something else because you think that it's a good person to do that or whatever. So I think more where it gets sticky is in that interspace. And this is a whole other line of like how we feel towards the mystery, how
Hmm.
we feel towards like the untamed, how we feel towards sexuality, like sex and the nature of sex itself, which is undefined, wild, and wants to be everything. It wants to experience itself in all these ways. And so it's like you've got this well behaved life, and now suddenly you go to this like week long Tantra workshop, and you come back and you're like, uh oh, I think I have this kinky fetish, but I better put it away. And so we have no languaging or frame for any of this. And we have very few places to explore it that are truly like clean and safe.
So when you say sex versus, or not versus, but sex and the erotic, how are they different?
I mean, to me, the erotic is only sex, but I would say that, like, physical sex is one form of exploring the dance that the erotic likes to do. But
Hmm.
you don't have to have physical sex to dance that same dance. And it really is, before it's physical, it's energetic. I mean, that's the real dance, is in the energetic, it's not in the physical. But we like, in this society, we really like to be tangible about things, because if we can see them and identify them, they're real. But the truth of the matter is, the thing is happening way before anybody physically explores it.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's just like intimacy is not talking about your feelings. To me, intimacy is really very bare. It's deeply unadorned. And so it's the arising truth of the moment that is unapologetically, completely naked and unadorned. And so it's not intimacy with something else, it's intimacy with the nakedness of that thing, and then the speaking of it or the moving from it that actually creates a field of intimacy between you and anything else, because it clarifies the perceptual field. And so in the clarification of the perceptual field, you are literally seeing differently. I mean, the erotic really feels like the kind of center of my work, because it's hard to describe it with words, but because that center is so deeply, constantly generative in its capacities, and so still, and also so much movement comes from there. So I feel like every bit that I understand about what I teach now has come from what I've been shown through that generative body. Um, but it's also really important in the model, because it is very much about the path of being rejoined with that generative body in each moment and in an intimate way. Because to me, that's what a liberation practice kind of is. It's not something that, like, you take on, or something that you get to be like a better meditator towards, but it's really something that is about, like, being more in the organic or original nature of the movement of life, that is within, like, greater life, but also within, like, this life, like you're just your being itself, that your being itself has the chance to coordinate around that and express it in all of the many manifestations of expression that it has the capacity for, which is constantly evolving. And that to me is like our nature, that consciousness is that, and we are that. And that's really just all we are, is consciousness.
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
we think about systemic oppression as being like a category, like some people are subject to systemic oppression. But the truth is, systemic oppression is the narrowing force within us that I spoke about earlier, that kind of has hijacked this natural connection with our original nature and movement. And obviously, it's heightened now more than maybe it was 400 years ago in some ways. So we've always had limitations on our expression and our being. It's never just been so liberated. Um, but I think that, and that's a natural part of the spiritual maturational process, is moving towards liberation. But to me, systemic oppression is the hallmark of a kind of society that has been organized around structures of power that are not natural. The
Hmm.
erotic is a connection to a natural structure and order and movement of power, a non ordinary movement of power that is us. And some people would call it love, some people would call it the erotic. It doesn't matter, but it's all the same thing. And so I think systemic oppression is like the way that we have become organized against that movement.
Mm,
So it figures in highly in my model just because it's the thing that's preventing it most globally. And it has this kind of structural orientation to it that you can actually do something about. Think about, you asked me, like, why do you talk about your work as sex work sometimes?
mm,
And it's because essentially, in what I have become, like the erotic is always moving through me. And so every interaction, every breath is part of that dance that feels to me like lovemaking, with everything, including like the flower that I sniffed or starting my car or any of those silly things that we seem to think of as being something else. Obviously,
mm.
there's this category of sex work that is more intentional around working with the body, working with our hangups around sex, and then also like reanimating the body into running the energy from a place that is not constructed, but is more natural. And so that dovetails so much with what I do in this work, which is running the energy or introducing the energy from this wide body of existence versus this narrowed body of what is sex. And now we're doing sex, and doing sex means this, and I'm performing sex.
Mm,
They line up super nicely because, like most of life, on some level, we feel we're performing it,
mhm.
doing life, and there's a one-to-one relationship there with how we're still performing something that actually is a natural movement.
So if someone just wanted general advice from you on how to have more intimacy with the erotic in their day-to-day reality, what would you offer them?
The easiest rule of thumb is take off all your clothes. So, the erotic loves to be in a space in which it plays with exposure, and not gratuitous exposure so much, um, but the natural drilling down below all the layers of defensiveness and covering that we do to try and ostensibly kind of protect ourselves and protect our vulnerability. So it's the practice of like not speaking or not moving until you feel like you're getting to the place where there's honesty. And it might just be a current of honesty. It might just be like a flavor or a texture of honesty. It doesn't really matter what you say. Everybody thinks it's about like the words or like the move, what you do, what you say. They have to be perfect. The truth is, you could say gobbledygook. And if you say gobbledygook, but you say it from a place of honesty, people are going to be like, yep, I know exactly what you mean. Right? Because really, that's the substantive part of our conversation. And I also talk a lot about the fact that like conversation is always happening, even in silence. And so conversation is not just words or something that you are announcing. It's actually like bodies in conversation, fields in conversation. And we're always in conversation with multiple beings while we're in conversation this way. And so having a practice around becoming in conversation with the deeper movement of your being and the deeper language of that and the expression of it means really kind of like peeling off the pieces that are meant to keep you away from that. And when you do that, you wind up feeling a kind of more liberated existence because all of those ideas that have to keep you so safe and locked in place and not moving and hung up and perfect and all the things, they just kind of like fall away. And then you're just left standing there. And then you realize actually, ultimately, you don't have to do anything but just stand there. And you're not even really standing there. So that's the thing, is that like we've made it all out to be this huge endeavor, but it's really just kind of simple. It's really the removing of the things that feel so vital to your protection, so vital to your existence. It's bullshit. And when you're really in a situation of threat, even there, the intimacy with honesty will do more for you than the protection in some ways. Because you will then be able to know when to protect, when to walk out, when to speak, when not to speak, not from defensiveness, but from actual relationship with the moment. They're proposing that they're like doing addiction work or healing work or trauma work. But in essence, that's not the work that's happening. Like they're really just actually doing the work of retraining you to think differently about your addiction potentially and to learn to manage it for your whole life and to learn to accept that when you don't manage it, you're falling off the wagon or you're having a slip up or whatever the thing is. And so we have to like get clear about what these things can offer, rather than thinking that they're offering the thing that we are layering on top of them that they're offering, which actually they don't have the goods to give you. They're not designed that way. They're not designed for that. They may use the word, you know what I mean? Like lots of people use the word liberation, and lots of people use the word like authenticity, which is why I don't use that word anymore. And lots of people use the word power, but not too many of those people or systems are designed actually for you to get to the thing that are those things. They're designed to like give you an experience of those things that you think is that thing, so you can like use your mind to replicate that experience to basically manipulate your existence so that you can feel like your lack of existence is a better lack of existence than what you had before. We live in a world full of replication, and the substantive is hard to find. And I think the substantive is where that starvation gets rectified in the presence of the substantive. And so we could theoretically go through a phase of binging on the substantive, but at some point we have to get to a place where the binging abates and we release ourselves back into the substantive.
Mhm. Yeah, it's that switch from feeling like I need to consume to allowing the self to be consumed.
Exactly. Exactly. And trusting the process of that, like the alchemical process of that, that gets really confusing and uncertain and has lots of twists and turns, and that often looks like it's not leading towards that, even when it is.
And there's something in that metaphor that feels like it really, I don't want to say encapsulates, but like maps the form of the erotic in the sense of the consuming that consumes and surrendering to that dance.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what you kind of develop a taste for. I mean, I think that's the path, is like you develop a more heightened taste for that, even when it's really uncomfortable, because you recognize that, like, that is actually, it might be bitter at times, but it's actually still the thing. And so you want the thing more than the replication of the thing. And when that tipping point happens, and it doesn't happen once, it happens over and over and over again, that you kind of eat around the edges of it. But when you've eaten around the edges of it enough and that tipping point really, really takes over, then you're in a totally different experience of yourself. And then the whole external world will reorder in connection with that different experience of yourself. And that might happen over and over again too. But that's the way the process kind of goes. But no one can hold you through that process if they're only fixated on giving you a good time.
Mm. Or having you keep coming back.
or having you keep coming back for a good time.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now we've kind of gone back full circle to defining the two forms of sex work, which is like real sex work and prostitution. Even prostitution can be real sex work, but
Mm-hmm.
like, but it's the idea that like it's about just giving you a good time so you'll come back to spend more money, which is
Mm-hmm.
very different than like introducing an experience that opens to a much wider experience. Yeah, there's no question about the fact that when people really feel the thing, that when people really feel the thing, not once, but when they really feel the thing over and over again, it isn't like they have to have a developed taste. It's like you're reawakening the palate. There might be a whole grudging thing that happens for decades, but it still is like the palate still knows the difference. And the thing is, we always know the difference anyway. We just
Mm-hmm.
pretend we don't know the difference. We pretend that the substitutions are enough. For what reason? I really don't know because it's a waste of your life. But we do it anyway.